What is up, my dudes? Welcome to the world of 6 billion and the official launch of my channel. Today, I want to share my thoughts, my memes, and my spicy hot takes on the haunts of Halloween Horror Nights Orlando 2022. From when I first started attending Halloween Horror Nights back in 2010, a lot has changed, but a lot has also stayed the same. Year after year, the same tricks and tactics are used, and while this year is in the top half of those that I've attended, it's still a far cry from what used to be. And that's okay, because a B+ is still better than most of my grades were in high school. I also want to note that when I'm reviewing these haunts, I'm reviewing the designs, the tactics, and the overall atmosphere, and not the human element. These haunts take years to design and construct, and I don't think that a bad cast or last-minute staffing issues should drag down all that hard work. I still respect these characters for all the blood, sweat, and tears that they put into their performances, and I'll make sure to point out some of those committed actors as I go through these haunts. Anyways, let's get to these rankings, and if you disagree, don't be afraid to start a fight with me down in the comments, because my self-esteem can't get any lower than it already is. And right off the bat with these I personally think that Halloween is one of the worst haunts that HHN has ever done. Ever. I was pumped when this was first announced because some of the best IP haunts of all time have centered around Mikey, and unlike other properties, I didn't mind his return. Well, last year's Texas Chainsaw Massacre reboot was a risk taker and did some very unexpected things with the property, but nothing in this iteration of Halloween hasn't been done significantly better in previous years. Just look at these closet scenes side by side and tell me that this haunt looks like a worthwhile improvement. There is no recapturing that feeling of walking through spooky suburban Haddonfield on Halloween night, and instead it feels like these sets are just museum displays. And not a good museum, because they forgot a lot of those greatest hits that brought Michael Myers to the all-star status in the first place. The iconic intro from John Carpenter's film is translated in such a dull way that it feels more like an extension of the queue than anything else. And as impressive as the Myers house facade is, there's no reason this haunt needed to be in a soundstage. The inherently basic suburban sets felt stretched to fit the large layout, but weren't given any extra charm to make them feel immersive or even proportionate. Leaving out key scenes from the film also affects the overall story, not to mention the pacing, in a negative way. Michael Myers is placed everywhere to hide the lack of different scare tactics, and sometimes he's even in 2 places at once. The biggest problem that I have is that the best scene in the entire haunt is literally a blink and you miss it moment. Michael Myers staring down at you from the top of those stairs is completely terrifying, or at least it would be if you were in that scene for more than 2 seconds. And what an underwhelming finale. The mirrors feel like a cop-out ending, a lazy way to end this IP on a scary note, and we've seen this trick used far more successfully both this year and, well, almost every other year too. I only hope that when Mikey inevitably returns to HHN, he just brings a few more tricks with him. See, he even looks sad right now. Over to the scaredy cat scale, Mikey is going to be hanging out with Cohen way over there at the bottom, because that was my face walking through this entire haunt. Now, I don't despise Hellblock Horror like some people do. I think it was just an okay haunt with a lot of missed opportunities. But still, even with all the drama surrounding this haunt, it should have been a lot better than it actually was. While this haunt was a last-minute replacement, the lore and background details are impeccably crafted, but unfortunately never given the time in the spotlight due to a design that favors length over creativity. Despite this, Hellblock Horror has one of the best facades of the year, with the lighting, blocking, and soundtrack immediately putting us on high alert. Even though the quality goes downhill fast, at least they did one thing pretty good in this haunt. For each of the 5 species that are locked up in the prison, fiends, vampires, aliens, zombies, and beasts, a different written language was created for each of their hell blocks, helping bring some distinction to the very monotonous concrete sets. The best parts of this haunt appear as either quick vignettes or Easter eggs that are nearly indecipherable under normal conditions. One of these is a giant prison map on the wall, which was created from scratch. If you get a good enough look, you can actually pinpoint the locations that you travel through in Hellblock Horror. Unfortunately, all the cool stuff is buried beneath a plethora of bland sets and a nearly unrecognizable cast of creatures from HHN's long history. These creatures end up being the downfall of Hell Block horror because they were rarely designed to be the focal points of their haunts. Their Hell Blocks are so tedious in their design that they don't allow any interesting scare opportunities, so we end up with a bunch of forgettable background creatures in a bunch of forgettable sets with a bunch of forgettable audio cues. It feels like kicking a dead horse. With the main carnage only supplied through projections, most of the character interactions feel harmless, more like finding a lost pet than a murderous creature breaking out of a maximum security prison. Well, that corpse is a sight to behold, and the finale is also surprisingly good. This just feels like a regular old prison. Every scene that's ever had Old Smokey in it has felt the same for decades, and it's become derivative instead of fun. Hellblock Horror was so focused on stuffing the prison with as many inmates as possible that it forgot to be crazy and intense, and most of all just plain old fun. This concept was ripe for a short and bombastic haunt, and even if that had been a failure, it still would have been better than what we got. These inmates are making new friends with Cohen, and now Michael Myers, and maybe the power of friendship will teach these monsters to be scary again. These next 8 haunts are a noticeable step up in quality from the previous 2 and help cement what a solid lineup we received this year. While I do enjoy Descendants of Destruction, there are so many cool and meaningful details that are obscured in the low lighting, and unlike the fan service of Hellblock Horror, missing these details ends up being incredibly detrimental to the overall experience. It's almost like seeing a pretty good movie and then realizing that it was based off of a far superior book and then getting pissed off because the movie was actually trash. Descendants of Destruction is a cousin to Seeds of Extinction from 2018, this time showing how the mutation has affected the survivors, which means we don't get as many cool plants as last time. No, I'm not talking about you. The shared universe is visible through Easter eggs, similar soundtracks and lighting packages, and an identical first scare in each haunt. Split into 3 main sections, Descendants of Destruction utilizes lighting as its most powerful storytelling tool. Solar panels are visible on the hauntingly beautiful facade, followed by battery-operated lights deeper in the tunnels, before being surrounded by bioluminescent fungus once we've entered the caves inhabited by the mutants. The first section in the subway station is home to plentiful Easter eggs that highlight Universal's rich history, some of which I'll highlight here. This section ends with a massive set piece of a train car bursting through the ceiling, which was surprisingly accomplished only using a mirror. The second section does drag a bit, and it doesn't really evolve the story as much as it needs to. The typical junked up sets have been done before with much more character, but I will say that the butcher shop scene is tons of fun and smells phenomenal. The concept of only the strongest survive is also introduced, not only in the way that the butcher prepares smaller mammals, but also that he's seen mutilated just up ahead in the next hallway. There's definitely some missed opportunities to go off the rails. Luckily, the caves are the strongest aspect of this haunt. The rockwork was modeled after 3D scans of real cave systems, and thus feels incredibly organic. Mirrors also help enlarge and disorient the space, and the fungi are a design highlight of the entire year and provide excellent camouflage for these heart-stopping scares at the end. While the caves may be just a tad too bright, the costuming is spot on, so I'm okay with taking the L on this one. Descendants of Destruction doesn't manage to be the full, complete package that Seeds of Extinction was, but it does still manage to evolve the lore in a meaningful way. Elevated by some jolting cave scares, the fear factor of this haunt is your typical HHN fare. Descendants of Destruction is now arriving at the Rue Avenue stop. I know it might come as a shock to hear that Prohibition and Art Deco are some of my favorite motifs to explore. I've just never been able to see the sex appeal for witches. I like girls that are a bit curvier, with a smooth, seductive voice, and have lofty goals and ambitions. I also haven't been scared by them either. Spirits of the Coven doesn't necessarily need to be scary, and I'm really glad that it wasn't. It was tense and unsettling, and slightly whimsical, like a dark fantasy experience instead of a jump scare extravaganza. I'm thrilled that this haunt isn't so reliant on the same old scare tactics and story techniques as everything else this year, but there's still a few puzzle pieces that are missing, and they're big ones. Walking into Soundstage 22 was the vibe of the year. Swinging lounge music, the best facade of the whole event, and spooky black cats everywhere. So nostalgic and so good. For all its failures, the scenic in this haunt is amazing, reminiscent of the Lady Luck haunt that I'm still sad that we never got. These first few scenes are full of whimsy until suddenly this witch just devours a dude's neck. Holy crap. Venturing through these sets reminded me of my favorite years of HHN, and was honestly a feeling that I hadn't experienced in almost a decade. These sets didn't seem formulaic, and the glass bottle rooms and the bootlegger tunnels were some exceptional scenes. They do a pretty good job of portraying the unease of wandering around in a restricted area, helped by the fact that there are very limited actors and boo holes in this section. A few more subtleties could have helped raise the tension, but still, it's an effective slow burn experience unlike anything else at the event. Despite the lovely sets, Spirits of the Coven just becomes insanely confusing as the haunt goes on, especially since it mostly abandons the concept of being lured in by the titular coven. We know that some men end up brainwashed to do the dirty work, and they end up providing some intense and physically intimidating scares, and some men end up getting distilled into Jaeger bombs. We do see some nice Halloween-themed bath soaps, but it's never super clear on what the spirits are or how they're created. These questions might be answered in the finale, but it's so abstract that it ends the haunt on a very confusing note. My main problems lie with a concept that is sexually charged, but only so when the witches are beautiful by conventional standards. Once the witches show their true form, they aren't given any good set pieces or really anything to do besides grunt work. Why relegate your core characters to the laziest parts of the haunt? The real horrors would have lied with watching these brainwashed men realize that they're helpless to stop their fate and that they're forced to carry out these terrible acts for these haggish witches. Exploring the power dynamics between those two classes could have been pretty cool and brought us some pretty unique set pieces. The Kitty Cat Club in Case Files Unearthed last year was an excellent example of a lustful environment without TNA, but unfortunately couldn't be replicated in Spirits of the Coven. Maybe my expectations were just a little too high, but I can't overlook all the risks that this haunt took and succeeded at. While these witches may have been looking for another black cat to join their coven, they instead found an angel who's going to heavily judge them for not being scary. The Horrors of Blumhouse is a tricky haunt to rank. I'll be the first to admit that I hate the way that Universal translates their IPs. They tend to borrow a lot of story beats from the original source material, but not a lot of those big set pieces that would be really cool to see in a haunted house. Sometimes the entire point of the IP gets lost in translation, and the haunt just feels more amateur than it does professional. Universal tends to choose these IPs that have massive expectations placed on them, and more often than not they take the budget-friendly route. Or at least up until we got that Hill House facade last year. With the Horrors of Blumhouse, my faith has been a bit restored. Freaky falls victim to favoring plot over spectacle, but perhaps the biggest surprise in all of my years of attending is how well the Black Phone section works. It does feel more like a psychological adaptation, encompassing the feeling of walking through a dark, confusing maze. It's astonishing, considering the Black Phone has limited environments and likely wouldn't have even been on the table if the grabber wasn't such a marketable antagonist. Universal uses the darkness to its advantage instead of hiding behind it. There's never just plain black walls, there's always subtle textures and lighting choices that make it feel almost otherworldly. Nothing feels overutilized or stale, despite the incredibly long and intense length. Blumhouse is one of the only haunts that gets a pass on good, repetitive jump scares because that's the niche that they fill each year. And let me tell you, that grabber scene in the kitchen, it is amazing the tension that Universal can create when they aren't putting boo holes every 5 feet. Unfortunately, Freaky falls victim to the aforementioned plotting issues and feels like a trailer for something much better. The Freaky section is nearly one continuous hallway with very little added space to give any breathing room to the experience. I do have to mention that initial body swap scene, utilizing scrims, a Pepper's Ghost effect, smart actor placement, and some giant set pieces. It's one of the best wow moments that I've had in recent years. This is the type of smart design translation that I expect from every IP, without having to resort to cheap narration or video effects to spell everything out. I also liked the intro into the mansion. The kills are represented well with a new kind of bottleneck introduced to HHN Orlando. Too bad that many of the set pieces are vignettes that can be easily missed because there's a lot of fun that could have been had in this section. Both haunts suffer from lackluster endings that have to nicely wrap everything into a bow. While these ending scenes are short, they again feel pointless. I think they're supposed to be hype moments, like when Captain America picked up Mjolnir in Avengers Endgame, but these scenes didn't have the resources to elicit that emotional response, and they come across as cheap. The Horrors of Blumhouse is the best of the bunch, and I only hope that Universal can continue to show that these aren't just marketing vehicles. The Horrors of Blumhouse are actually, well, horrifying for once. Not even Chino wants to be near the grabber. Thank you everybody for watching. Like, subscribe, leave a comment. Whatever you do, just know that I greatly appreciate your support. Part 2 is gonna be rolling out soon, so make sure to check that out. And until next time, don't forget that the world is a better place because you are in it. Go live that truth. This is 6 Billiam signing off. Bye forever.